Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I cannot wait today to dive into All Fours by Miranda July. If you just heard my voice breaking, that is because I am coming to you not only from my office, but also with COVID. This is the first time I've had it. I have to say I was getting a little cocky. I with my sister and one of my sons, I was just like, oh my God, I don't get it. I don't get COVID. And then sure enough, I got it. It's not so bad, but I'm trying to stay away from my husband, bit of a delicate flower, so that I don't get him sick. And I have to say, I'm not all that bummed out about holding up in my office here. I really feel in some ways like I am gaining the psychic space and kind of a room of my own that is not only what Virginia Woolf tells us to find, but also, in fact, what Miranda July is espousing in All Fours. So I always begin these lectures with this question of why are we going to spend, an hour or 90 minutes talking about July? And in some ways, it seems like I don't even need to address that question because All Fours has become such a touch point in many ways. There are headlines about it in the New York Times and in the Atlantic, and it's certainly caused a major splash. But I will say that I have been a long, long time Miranda July fan. I loved No One Belongs Here More Than You, which was her first collection of short stories. And I also really loved, it's upside down, now it's backward. I also really loved The First Bad Man. So these books were unbelievably great. This one, No One Belongs Here More Than You, is a short story collection. The First Bad Man is a novel. And I just found both of them so intriguing and so compelling. They're both very strange in a kind of idiosyncratic and really interesting way. Sometimes people level the criticism at Miranda July that she's a little bit kind of twee or a little bit quirky. And I don't find her twee. And in some ways I do find her quirky, but only in the best of ways. And frankly, her prose is so innovative and unique and interesting and in some ways so jarring and strange that I really love everything about it. Her writing, in fact, reminds me of Mary Gateskill and also Joy Williams. If you're really sinking deeply into Miranda July right now, you should check out those other two writers just for their strangeness and kind of the sort of oblique way that they are approaching the novel. As I just kind of rushed into this novel, I realized, in fact, that in many ways, All Fours is a more relatable book, and so I was all the more excited to talk about it. It feels slightly more mainstream than her other two works, which is really important because I think the message here is extremely germane and really important for an entire group of women to hear. So there is a lot in this book about sex, which I love. There is a lot about menopause. There's a lot about work and identity. And those are all things that I think in many ways have come to the fore. Certainly menopause has. And I think people are speaking more frankly about sex now than they have. So some of these topics she's tackling really feel very mainstream and extremely urgent right now. So I was really happy that this novel of her three books that I have loved is one that I really think has a very, very wide potential audience and is really, striking a chord with a lot of women who are my age and younger. And it is a book that I keep thrusting on everyone. I will say I had a friend over not too long ago and she was like, oh, you're reading the filthy book. And I was like, oh my gosh, apparently it's called the filthy book. Is it filthy? Filthy is kind of a funny word these days. It's somewhat flattering. In some ways, this book is filthy, but I really love it, meaning that a lot of the sex writing is very graphic, but it always is serving a purpose, and it's unique and interesting and just incredibly well nuanced. So one friend thought I was reading the filthy book. Another younger friend, who I really was pushing this on, said that she really didn't feel like she could read it, in fact, because she might blow up her whole life. So this is the kind of weight that this book has for people. I think in some ways, it really is revolutionary for people, and not only is it incredibly inspiring and helping us to think about conventions like motherhood and marriage and identity after 50, but it's also just absolutely incredible prose. For those of you who like an agenda, here is the agenda. We're going to start with a very brief bio of Miranda July. Then we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about the cover art, the title, the dedication, and the opening of the novel. Then we're going to talk about the narrative voice and the question of autobiography. I've listened to a lot of interviews and read a lot of articles about this novel, and Miranda July has a lot to say about the conflation between author and narrator here, and it's really interesting. We're also going to talk about structure. We're going to dive fairly deeply into the humor, in part because it's excellent, but also because I think in many ways it allows us to look at other aspects of the novel that are working incredibly well. We're obviously going to talk about sex, not at any great length. She writes so well about sex. We're going to talk about menopause and feminism. We're going to talk about the revolutionary aspect of the book, and then we will close. Today's lecture is a tiny bit different in that I am going to assume that you have read the novel. I'm not going to talk about any spoilers until kind of later in the lecture, and I will let you know before I say anything that's really going to spoil anything for you. But the book as a whole and sort of the ending and the organic nature of the arc on the part of the narrator of the book seems so important to me that I really wanted to dive into the entire thing and not treat this as a sort of pre-reading kind of exercise. So Miranda July was born in 1974. She's 50 years old. I have in my notes here that she was born in Vermont, but she was raised in Berkeley. Her mother and father are writers and also publishers. They had a publishing imprint that was publishing a lot of like alternative spirituality and kind of new age stuff and martial arts and alternative health titles. July has been quoted as saying that her family was very DIY, which I like that as a notion. I take that to mean that she had a lot of freedom and that there was a lot of creativity and a lot of impetus for the creation of things in a nice way. She went to college prep in college preparatory high school, maybe, or college preparatory school, which is in Oakland, which is one of these like incredible high schools that kind of operates in this very alternative universe, but is also incredibly heavyweight in terms of its academic emphasis. She actually made a movie in high school, I think, that caused quite a splash. She went on to UCSC, a short film, not just like a full-length movie, as far as I know. I did not dig into that research. She went to UCSC, which is UC Santa Cruz, for a couple of years, 2 years, and then moved to Portland. She married Mike Mills, who is one of my favorite directors. He made Beginners and 20th Century Women, and most recently, Come On, Come On. Just unbelievably great movies. It's interesting to think about the two of them as kind of like a power couple. And he talks, in fact, quite a bit about how Miranda is much more brave than he is. And I do think in lots of ways her work is kind of more revolutionary. His tends to be a bit nostalgic in ways that I absolutely love, but it does feel like she's taking more risks in her work. They have one child. His name is Hopper Mills, which I love that. I don't know if it's like a Dennis Hopper homage or if it's like a, the painter, Edward Hopper. That child is non-binary. And at the end of the acknowledgments, July thanks Hopper for their boldness and how their boldness, in fact, emboldened her. You're probably thinking, if you didn't know all of that, that this is mapping fairly closely onto the narrator of All Fours, which we're about to get to, but that is, in fact, the case. It does map very nicely. She has work that has been shown at the Tate. She has some movies. I've only seen Kajillionaire, which was a movie that came out a few years ago, and I really liked it. I'm not sure I fully understood it, but I think that's the nature of her work. Again, I love all of her literature. I'm much more drawn to her writing than I am to her visual art. She does a lot of dancing on Instagram. Recently, she did a very interesting thing with Margaret Qualley, who's this beautiful actor. I believe it's Andie MacDowell's daughter. I think that's right. Which caused quite a stir because it was this very sort of provocative relationship playing out on Instagram, which was largely a performance. So she does a lot of performance art. And in fact, a lot of her work, does draw a lot of attention, in part because it is somewhat shocking and certainly is bold. Her movies are known to have this kind of slice of life quality. That's not my wording, that's someone else's. And they're definitely quirky. Some people, again, might call them twee. I don't think of them as twee because I think there's some very large messages, both in the fiction and in the movie making, that you really have to take the time to parse. They're a little quirky in the sense that there's a goofy quality to some of it and a little bit of a nostalgic quality, but all of it has this kind of slant that I find really provocative and really inspirational. We're now going to dive into the novel by taking a close look at the cover art. So this was a cover, I have to say, that did not grab me at first. It just, for whatever reason, didn't totally appeal. Those of you who are on the YouTube could see that her other collections have just very, very plain, very bold covers. But once you dive into this cover, I think it really is telling us a lot. So first of all, you notice on here that this is a cliff. And as you get further into the book, you understand all of the nuances of the cliff. Again, I'm assuming that most of you have read this, and even if you haven't, it's not really spoiling anything to say that the cliff is this notion of menopause. That essentially, as a woman, your hormones drop precipitously, your estrogen falls off like a cliff. And in the novel, July makes much of the fact that that also feels like a kind of metaphorical cliff in terms of desire, that desire is going to wane, and also this idea of sort of not knowing who you are after, childbearing, and this real sort of sense of not understanding what is coming next and not having any role models in that time. What's important too, though, in one of the interviews that I listened to, July made much of the fact that there is this kind of glowing light. So we have the cliff, and then, importantly, kind of at the bottom of the cliff here, we have what looks like the sunrise. And so there is this kind of optimism that I find really intriguing and important. I also, if we're going to get really into it, we have the sky that's up here at the top, and it's sort of like a sky is the limit kind of feeling. And I also, I was not actually initially drawn to this font, but the more I thought about it, I wonder if it's an echo of the lawn chair onto which she spray painted "Call Me." It looks a little bit like it might be kind of like a spray paint font. And I like the idea too of the sturdiness of it and the fact that it's somewhat DIY and somewhat kind of childlike in some ways. It's kind of ludic, it's kind of playful. It's a very bold choice and a departure from her other work, but one that I think is interesting. There's also this idea of her name and the title as being on the margins, and then this cliff and the sun as really being central. So your eye is, of course, drawn into the future in a way that I think is very symbolic. I think we can also imagine this kind of artwork too as that kind of romantic painting. And when I say romantic, I mean that it's from the Romantic era. It's from, the 19th century, when people were doing these landscape paintings that had everything to do with the sublime. And the sublime there doesn't mean just like beautiful or gorgeous. Sublime in that case means, in fact, this awe that humans have in the face of nature. There's a lot of focus of beauty and a lot of focus on desire in the novel. So this notion of the sublime and of the human as being sort of dwarfed by nature has a lot to do, I think, with, what is happening in the female body at the end of the child rearing period, but also this sense of being awed by the sense of possibility, and in some ways, the sense of mortality. So the sublime has everything to do with understanding the human condition and the fact that, all of us humans will die. So the idea of being awed by nature also has to do with the idea of being awed by the permanence of nature and the fleeting nature of man. Miranda July, in one of the interviews, had a really interesting thing to say about how, as a young person, that you sort of envision your life until late adulthood, and the things that you might envision would be a career, maybe a family, maybe children. And then in the second half of life, the sort of end result isn't all of this kind of production and this fecundity. It is, in fact, death. So I really think that once you dig in, the cover is incredibly rich. I also really like the title. So at first, I was like, wow, for the Filthy book, the idea of all fours, it does, in fact, conjure this very kind of physical idea of someone on all fours, and the idea of, in some ways, being very vulnerable in that position. If you're thinking about it in terms of a sexual position with the man behind a woman or a man behind a man, you have this idea of penetration, and you have this idea of the person who is on all fours as being somewhat vulnerable. But as with everything in this novel, Miranda July is seeking to turn that on its head and really makes a lot of the fact that being on all fours is, in fact, a very stable position. On page 301, we have this beautiful echo of the title. It's interesting because it's coming so late in the book, and we are, allowed during the course of the novel to be thinking about all fours in all sorts of different ways. And then it's really gratifying when we come to this description. So this is when our narrator and her best friend Jordy are at an exhibition of Jordy's work, and the description of what our narrator is seeing is this fragmentary line that reads this: "A headless woman on her hands and knees." Then Jordy says, Everyone thinks doggy style is so vulnerable, but it's actually the most stable position, like a table. It's hard to be knocked down when you're on all fours. So this is such a compelling idea because throughout the course of the novel, we have been thinking about all fours in all sorts of different ways. And here it is really coming to the fore and really sort of this nice conclusion about some of that vulnerability as in fact being very stable. And the idea of desire and sex and vulnerability as being more stable. But it's really, I think, just a very provocative title in many ways. Okay, we're going to now open up the novel. You may have noticed that my copy has this nice sticker in the middle that says signed copy that I got from my local independent bookstore. And of course, Miranda July, those of you on the YouTube can see her signature here. Of course, she has like the coolest signature ever. It's just kind of like two kind of loopy, crazy looking lines. It's just like very cool, as with everything Miranda July. And as we dive in, I'm going to realize that there is some sort of story collection or some sort of novel of hers that I totally skipped. Apparently, between No One Belongs Here More Than You and The First Bad Man, there is also a book called It Chooses You. That is a text that I have not, in fact, read, and I look forward to digging into. On the next page, we have the title page, and then we get to the page that says For Isabel. With very little sleuthing, you can find out that Isabel is in fact Isabel Albuquerque, who is a sculptor. So you have this idea of, again, of Geordie and the narrator as mapping very tidily onto Miranda July and her best friend Isabel Albuquerque. In fact, Geordie's artwork looks a lot like Isabel Albuquerque's work. The one sculpture that I saw, which I will put up on YouTube if you're watching, it's like the body of a woman from behind. She is in fact headless, and the torso, it's a naked woman, but it's painted to look kind of like a fawn, you know, with that sort of fur with the white spots. I haven't thought a lot about this work, other than the fact that chopping off the women's heads seems really interesting to me, unless what we're talking about is being really, in the body and being very rooted and not being, too in our heads. I don't know. That seems like a very facile interpretation. But this woman, Isabel Albuquerque, is in Miranda July's best friend. And the other thing that maps nicely onto Isabel and Miranda is the fact that after Miranda became a mother, she found that she wasn't able to spend, all of her leisurely mornings writing in bed because she now had a baby. So she made an agreement with Mike Mills, her husband, to spend one night a week in her studio. And she would spend Wednesday nights there. And in fact, on those nights, she and Isabel would have dinner together. So you have this sense here again of life, really mapping very clearly and very purposefully in many ways onto literature. We then have part 1, and now we have chapter 1. Sorry to trouble you was how the note began, which is such a great opener. Please trouble me, trouble me. I've been waiting my whole life to be troubled by a note like this. Sorry to trouble you, but it looks like someone was using a telephoto lens to take pictures through your windows from the street. If it was someone you know, then sorry for the misunderstanding. If not, though, I got the make, model, license of their vehicle. Brian, from next door, and his phone number. You don't really need a telephoto lens because we have giant windows in front with no curtains. Sometimes I pause before coming inside and watch Harris and Sam innocently going about their business. Harris mutely explaining something to Sam or lifting Sam into the air. I feel such tenderness toward them. Try to remember this feeling, I say to myself. They are the same people up close as they are from here. A couple of really important things about this opening. One is simply the fact that we are talking here about a first-person narration. So right at the beginning, we have, I've been waiting my whole life to be troubled by a note like this. So you have a sense here of I, which makes the novel feel very confessional. It's, the first person can be limiting, but in fact, when we are doing this kind of deep dive into one woman's experience, this is kind of the obvious way to go about that. Whenever you read something in the first person, and certainly if you're choosing to write something in the first person, it's always good to ask, why this person and why now? And this why this person is obvious here. I mean, this is someone who is wanting to, convey her experience to the world. But this question of why now is very interesting because, in fact, this is, either the end or the beginning, depending on how you feel about the close of the novel, of a really interesting phase in this woman's life. We have, at the end, 5 years have passed, but we're looking at this real departure, and, much is made in the media media about how this book has to do with our narrator going on a supposed road trip and not even getting 20 minutes away from her home before she, in fact, is staying in that hotel, and really having what amounts to a really important sexual awakening. It's like a sexual affirmation in many ways. So it's very clear why she is writing this now. And it's very interesting in the light of the kind of evolution that we are going to see of this woman to come back to the beginning and realize that it's beginning with Brian, the next door neighbor, and the telephoto lens. So we can read, a phallic symbol into the telephoto lens. We can look at this space that is this domestic space and see that already in the very, very beginning of the book, our narrator is outside of the domestic. She is not, in fact, in the home. But this is also a home where they have no curtains. Everything is very open. There's this idea of vulnerability and, in fact, eagerness on the part of our narrator to have some kind of adventure. This idea of having someone bother her. You can think of Hot and Bothered, but you can also just think of this idea of like a woman who needs some measure of excitement when, in fact, she has a somewhat long-term marriage and a young child. I also really loved this description of her being outside and seeing them and reminding herself that they are, in fact, the same people when you are up close. I have 3 kids who are in their 20s now, and I would have all of these kind of nostalgic feelings about them, even when they were right under my nose. And a lot of that was because it was so taxing to raise them. It was super anxiety provoking and also really boring at times. Sorry, kids. But so this idea of a woman as seeing things from the outside and being somewhat distanced from her domestic space is really, really compelling. It's also extremely important. You'll notice that I've been saying the narrator and the narrator. Our narrator is unnamed. And that is something that, comes up a lot in the criticism of the book. And by criticism, I just mean like the articles about the book. So there's this idea of this person as being unnamed. And that's very important because, in fact, that's part of this idea of inviting us to conflate the author of our book, Miranda July, with the narrator. So she has spoken somewhat at length in these different interviews about this kind of quandary where a lot of times women in particular, if you write a first-person novel, people will assume, in fact, that it is about you. They will automatically make that jump. And again, this happens more with women who are writing first-person novels than with men. So she was kind of, for a while, trying to think about how to give some space between herself and the narrator. I think at different times she had a name for this narrator. And then, in fact, decided that she was really going to lean into this. And I myself really enjoyed that. Sometimes I think it can be frustrating to think like, wait, what if this is real and what if this is not real? And like, what about this is actually Mike Mills? And what if this is not Mike Mills? Not a lot of the biography has changed. Miranda July lives in Los Angeles. And in fact, the times when she is speaking about her work are the times when I think we are most invited to really conflate her with the narrator. So very early in the novel, we have, with the characteristic humor that just absolutely pervades this book, this is page 6 here. We have a really clear sense of what this woman does for work. And in fact, it sounds very, very much like Miranda July. This is in an exchange with Brian. He may have just been admiring your house, Brian suggested. I didn't like that. It's a nice house, but come on. I didn't spend the last 2 days not calling because our house is nice. I'm a bit of a public figure, I said, going a little heavy on the false modesty. False modesty is one of those things that's hard to go easy on, like squirting whipped cream from a can. He said that's why he was concerned because of my notoriety. I humbly replied, well, thank you. It's really so nice to know you're keeping your eye on things. It's literally my job, Brian said. Right, I said, snapping out of it. I'm not a household name. I won't go into the tedious specifics of what I do, but picture a woman who had success in several mediums at a young age and has continued very steadily, always circling her central concerns in a sort of ecstatic fugue state, with the confidence that comes from knowing there is no other path. Her whole life will be this single conversation with God. God might be the wrong word for it. The universe, the undernetting. I work in our converted garage. So this is so excellent. You have this idea, the beginning part about the false modesty. And when he says notoriety is a funny word. People are bandying it about, very freely these days. But notoriety has kind of a negative connotation. If somebody is notorious, it's like, it's not great. So the fact that Brian is saying, that she has this notoriety, also the fact that Brian's like, I'm not impressed by who you are. I'm just doing my job as an FBI agent. So you have this idea here, although, of course, poor Brian, it turns out, in fact, that he is no longer working for the FBI and, in fact, is very ill, as many of you know, which again is so interesting when we go back to the beginning and look at the reality for Brian. Like, Brian is on a dead end. Like, he is not having a lot of rosy, glowing sunrise at the bottom of his cliff. Poor Brian at the very beginning of the book is like looking at a terminal illness. He's looking at a cliff that is going to end very badly, whereas our narrator, in fact, is much more kind of on the ascent. But we have at the beginning this false modesty, which is so funny. And you are, as a person, if you are conflating Miranda July and the narrator, and you're someone like me, who is both like so impressed by Miranda July, but also like kind of jealous, and also just like really intimidated in lots of ways, and just like so intrigued and impressed, it's really, really beautiful and really warming, and actually very like approachable feeling to have her say like, oh, I've had this success and kind of middling success, but also this idea of wanting more and understanding that she's not exactly a household name, blah, blah, blah. But then this idea too of the passion with which she is dedicated to the work, and this idea that there is no other path is a very important note that she's hitting at the very beginning, because in fact, that drive and that ambition and that desire to work is the thing that is really going to inform, we have a sense, her second half of her life after her childbearing years are over. We're now going to move on and talk very briefly about the structure of the novel. I am always interested when a book has kind of a like a thing that people are talking about. And with this book, it's the menopause or the perimenopause and the filthiness of the sex. But it's also this, what you hear is that it's this woman who, largely because it's in the jacket copy and it's in a lot of the reviews and whatnot, this idea that it's this woman who's supposed to go on this road trip to New York and instead redoes a hotel room and has this sexual experience. What's interesting to me is that is all complete by page 135. So the first part of the book, and this book is 313 pages long, so the part with Davy is in fact, not even a third. Wait, my math is terrible. It's definitely a third, but like it's only about a third of the book. And then we have 60 pages that are the second part of the book where she is essentially super lovesick, and that ends with her experience with Audra. So we have this idea of her as, in the beginning, she has this incredibly intense experience that is essentially unrequited. Then she is totally forlorn and lovesick, then, comes out of it with this kind of life-changing sexual experience. And that's only 80 pages. So again, we're only, essentially 200 pages into the novel. We have a long part of the novel, in fact, in some ways it's fitting because it would sort of feel like this, that has to do with her marriage and this question of whether or not Harris is having affairs, a lot of stuff about the menopause. We're going to look at that. The fact that she, blamed, her distraction with her love sickness on menopause when in fact it was happening to her was so funny. But we have this real exploration of menopause. Then we move into this question of this kind of new arrangement that the two of them are having. Then we have another kind of experience where she has this love affair with this woman, Chris, which leads to another kind of love sickness. And then very happily, we have essentially what is an epilogue at the very end. It's called Part 4, but it's only 9 pages long and it's 5 years in the future. I actually like the idea of it being another part and not being an epilogue, because it really provides some continuity, and it's suggesting to us, in fact, that it's not, what's happening 5 years from now in your life is not, in fact, a departure, and it's not just a wrapping up. It is, in fact, a continuation of this evolution that our narrator is having. It's very important in some ways that it is Part 4 and not, in fact, an epilogue, even though I think that might have been a temptation. And at first I did sort of look at it that way. So the point of all of that is that the stuff with Davy and even the stuff with Audra is really, the first half of the book. And then the second half is grappling with this notion of like, why is it that we have always done marriage the same way? And all of that beautiful kind of open source stuff where we have a lot of voices. She has said in interviews that those are, in fact, actual women, which you might have guessed, who she did, in fact, ask. She would ask these questions and have these overwhelming, responses to them, both about the conventions of marriage and what one should do if one has doubts about one's marriage, and then also about menopause, both, what's going wrong for people, but then also this idea of what is the best thing about kind of making it through perimenopause and into this next period of life, which in fact is extremely hopeful. It's important to note that Miranda July wrote this book over a period of 5 years. So she began it when she was 45 and in kind of the heart of perimenopause, and finished it at 50. But you do have this sense of optimism, which I think is incredibly important. She did speak in an interview about the fact that she didn't want it to be, from the beginning, it couldn't be hopeful. Like essentially there had to be a lot of darkness and a lot of, unsettled feeling in order to have, this optimism at the end feel authentic and feel earned, both in the novel, but also in terms of women's experience. Now we're going to dive into the humor of the book. This, to me, I find all of Miranda July funny in kind of like a low-key, kind of quirky, well, there's that word. It's not even quirky. It's like idiosyncratic and very interesting. Cajillionaire was very funny in lots of ways, but like obviously not in like the normal kind of ways, because nothing about Miranda July feels particularly normal. But today I'm excited to look at the humor because I think it's an excellent lens through which to view a bunch of really important elements in the book. So this element of comic relief is so important. There's some really dark aspects of this book. And in fact, I think that humor or like just kind of raunchy parts or, very sad parts. And all of those are times when comic relief, it's not even that you need it, but it is so welcome because, in fact, it is so well done. We're going to dive into a part at the beginning that tells us everything about our narrator's relationship with her child. So it's that funny part when the child is like, you're not like normal moms, because normal moms, like if you show them something you made, like they would go, crazy and be like, oh my God, I love it, which I think maybe I was like that. I don't know. But, again, Miranda July with her DIY family, you get the sense that maybe she grew up with a little less fawning over her and perhaps a little more kind of, what did we call it? Like free range parenting. But this idea that her child is like, hey, you're not like other moms is extremely important. And then the child is like, I don't really need it, but maybe you could try it at like my next birthday party because other kids expect you to be like that. So she says this, all right, I'll give it a whirl then. As I dried them off, we talked about how I would bring them a little keepsake from each state. A toy. Not a toy, probably something from nature. A keychain would be fine. It might be a rock or a seed pod or a funny paper napkin from a diner. A napkin? I don't want a napkin. Just bring me one big good thing. So this is so excellent, and it is so funny because, this is the kind of thing that you would maybe do as a parent. You'd be like, oh, I'm going to bring you a seed pod, and the kid would be like, or maybe a keychain, minimum. And then this idea of bring me one big thing is actually very symbolic. She comes back with the spoon, which has everything to do with, spoon feeding and with nurturing and, with softness. I always think of like the fork and the knife and the spoon. I think of the spoon as being very female and the fork and the knife as being very male and like weirdly like soldierly. Maybe that's just me. But we have this idea of this gigantic spoon, and it's actually something that our narrator orders online. So we have this idea here, though, of a somewhat important thing, which is that this road trip where she's supposed to be collecting something from every state is not, in fact, going to happen. And so there is this conundrum. At one point the kid calls and she like has to go out in a parking lot and pretend like it looks like New York City. But this question of like, okay, then you can bring me back one big thing is symbolic, I think, in the sense that like the mom is going to come back with one big thing, and it's going to be a spoon, but it's also going to be this kind of newfound freedom and a new way of being a mother in some ways. Not exactly maybe what the child was wanting, but maybe better than a seed pod. I don't know. But also there is this notion here of like of how real it is when you're trying to raise a child, and how like you might have these grand aspirations of like giving them things from nature, and really what they want is a toy. So I love that in every interaction with the child, some of them are very magical, but in almost all of them, maternity is looked at in this realistic and often very unglamorous way, which is excellent. The next example we're going to look at is on page 53. This is when our narrator is in her motel room and she is working together with Claire, who is Davy's wife, on the design of the motel room. So one thing that this brings up that is a very important facet of the novel is the idea of a foil. So in many ways, Claire is kind of like a foil. There are a bunch of other foils, especially when she starts doing the open sourcing about marriage. There's her one friend who have like really, really passionate sex that they describe in a very funny way toward the beginning of the book. And it makes our narrator feel like she's totally lost, the incredible sex competition. But in fact, maybe it's Geordie. But anyway, we have this idea of this person, this other person and her partner as always being primary for each other, which is in fact a type of foil for the marital decisions that our narrator is going to be making. At this point, we have Claire, who is a real foil in the sense that she's I think, a receptionist, and she wants to move to Sacramento, and she wants to lead what is a very conventional life with Davy. She's not a type. She's not a one note. In fact, she really is very commanding and ambitious, and there are lots of ways that we really love Claire, but she also seems like someone who is much more conventional than our narrator, and we really see this difference between the two of them in this interaction, and it also really plays up, in fact, kind of like the weirdness of our narrator in a way that is just tremendous. Okay, on page 53, Claire says this. "Touch," she said, pointing to the new towels. "I politely patted one and then rubbed it with both hands and pressed my face into it. It was the nicest towel I'd ever felt. So thick and absorbent, it made all previous towels seem like sad little rags. There was a giant bath sheet, a hand towel, a washcloth, and another one that Claire described as a demi-towel. It was for anything truly dirty, like a toothpastey mouth or hair with conditioner in it. The demi-towel preserves the other towels for your face and body," she said, placing it beside the sink. "Did you make up demi-towel?" I whispered. "You can just leave the towels wherever, and Helen will replace them with a clean set every day, just the same as usual." I noticed Claire ignored about half the things I said to her, which made me feel a little like I was talking to my hard-of-hearing mother. So I love this so much. First of all, this is this real study of beauty and sensuality. So at first she pats the towels and then is absolutely sucked in by their tactile sense. So there's a lot of sensuality in all of these scenes. And notably, this motel room that gets made over, it's not just the visual. It smells like tonka bean, which I don't know how that smells, but I'm dying to know. And there's a lot of sense of the tactile in that space. So this idea here of her being really drawn in by the beauty and the tactile and sensual nature of the towel is very important. This is something that Claire is simply offering to her in a very matter-of-fact way, which is part of why it is so funny. And the fact that Claire, in fact, has these words like bath sheet and demi-towel, and the fact that our narrator whispers that to her, "Did you make up demi-towel?" I whispered. It's so funny, and we don't know that she's whispering it until the end, which really is kind of a kicker on the whole thing, because it's already funny enough, like, did you make that up? But you have this sense of her as learning a lot from this woman who is very conventional, and the fact that she is very kind of open, both to sensuality and to beauty, but also to what other women have to share with her. It's also very important that toward the end, she feels like she's talking to her hard-of-hearing mother. So there is a ton about maternity and paternity all throughout this novel. We are not going to have time to look at it. And when I say maternity and paternity, I mean basically the narrator's parents. There's a lot about her parents and her family of origin. But the fact that Claire here is essentially being equated and being sort of lumped in with the narrator's mother speaks to her conventionality, but it also speaks to the really sort of unconventional nature of our narrator. Keep in mind, too, the narrator is significantly older. Claire is in her mid-20s, but really seems to have her act together and is sort of surprising at every turn by how competent she is, and also very ambitious. She wants her $20,000 and is not afraid to bluff a little to get it. So it's this beautiful kind of study of the conventional versus the unconventional in a way that is also hilarious. So on pages 82 and 3, we have a portion of the book that is, essentially she is kind of in the midst of this experience, this very intimate non-sexual, well, it's kind of sexual, but like not intercourse experience with Davy that is really very transformational for her. And it's important that there's a lot of comedy in this, and that there's a lot of sort of it's not exactly self-deprecation, but it's sort of like owning up to her sense of awe and her sense of kind of being out of her depth in many ways with her desire, and the sense of desire is being renewed. So, you know, if you're a reader who's not maybe super comfortable with the idea of her having an extramarital affair 20 minutes from her home in a motel room that she has redone, the humor, I think, really adds some levity, and it's really, really well done. Okay, so on 82, she's describing one of her interactions with Davy. We drank tequila, and I wondered if the upside-down triangle of his upper body, his bony but broad shoulders narrowing down to his small waist, was perhaps a classic proportion with a kind of ancient resonance, something to do with Michelangelo's drawings or Da Vinci or whoever it was, the Da Vinci Code. Like if you measured all the angles of his upper body, you would discover those same measurements in the Bible or inscribed on a Greek vase, and they would also correspond, if scaled up, to a larger cosmological measurement, perhaps between the stars, celestial music. What was that? If I'd been at home working, I'd pause to look it up. But stunningly, I wasn't at home working, and I wouldn't look it up, and I really didn't want to look up anything ever again. We were sipping our drinks and talking. I was trying to explain what my work meant to me. It's really interesting because, again, we have this idea on the front of the book of the idea of the sublime and the idea of sort of the scope of desire. And when she does, I mean, it's very funny, like the Da Vinci Code thing is really funny, and celestial music, what is that? Like not even understanding these references. And, you know, obviously the Da Vinci Code is not quite what she's trying to get at here, but you have this sense of her as describing her desire in these terms that are gigantic. It's as if, you know, the scale is huge. So, you know, maybe is in the Bible, or maybe is on a Greek urn, speaking to the sense that female desire is something that has been around forever and that really should be inscribed in all of those places. You know, somewhat notably, it is not. I mean, the male body, yes, but like the female desire for the male body is, well, or female desire for anything, is not necessarily included in all of those spaces. So in some ways, she's kind of writing female desire into some of those texts, even by just evoking them. But the beautiful thing is that if she tried to do all of that and like laud his body and tell us how gorgeous this guy was, it would end up, I think, feeling like a little icky. And instead, it's funny, but also like really, really effective in terms of conveying the scale of her desire. And then, importantly, she goes right from the sort of stunning beauty of his body to the idea of her work, which is really, it's very important that in many ways desire is linked here with creativity and her work. And this idea of like stunningly, she wasn't at home and she wasn't going to look this up on the Google machine. That's my word, not hers. Okay. We were sipping our drinks and talking. I was trying to explain what my work meant to me. How life, usually so frustratingly scattered and elusive, came under my spell. I could name each thing no matter how obscure, and it would open to me as if it loved me. Working was a romance with life, and like all romances, always seemed on the verge of ending, was always out of my control. I said this last part half standing, with my arms grasping the air as if to catch a bird. I really got why people drank to unwind after work. This was great. I tried again to guess his secret passion. So this is so important when she's talking about, you know, she's drunk, which she's also like this whole idea of like, oh, I really get why people are drinking after work. It sort of brings everything back down to earth and deflates the thing that before was so kind of high flown and so kind of not overwritten, but like a really very, very large idea. And this idea of her work as helping her name things and this romance, it's very, the romance that she is having with Davy and then moving straight, like literally in the same paragraph into the idea of her work as a romance is incredibly important. So all of this idea of desire and this idea of feeling out of control and feeling like things are always going to end. I mean, first of all, there's some foreshadowing here. We're only on page 83 and we're kind of at the height of their connection. So you know that maybe things aren't going to go super well, but you have this idea of the importance of desire here. But it's coupled with this humor that takes it from feeling really kind of like pedantic or heavy or kind of saccharine, and instead makes it feel very real and also approachable, but also hilarious. The next example of humor we're going to look at is also during the affair with Davy. This is when things are really coming to an end, and our narrator is panicking, and they are separated, but he texts her a video of him dancing, and it's just like, transformative for her. So, and importantly, there are a few things about the use of humor here that are really important. One is that it helps to kind of take away some of the like desperation and some of the sort of the stuff that might feel a little more like hallmarky or a little more saccharine or like a little like icky, because it's leavened with enough humor that it makes the reader feel like to a certain extent Davy is important, and obviously she's totally lovesick for him, but the humor somehow allows us to see that in fact he's not kind of the end all, or at least it gives us some sort of intimation of that. But it's so well done. Okay. Men gave jewelry when they couldn't give a song or a dance about their love because they couldn't sing or dance, but he could. I stared at the name Davy on my phone, blood pounding in my head. I thought I should do some breathing exercises first, but I didn't have the discipline to take even a single long, slow breath before I called. Which, that part was so funny, the idea of like she should have done breathing exercises, just because it's so kind of like now and so cliche and so funny. But also you have a sense like, oof, there's a lot of desperation here. And there's something humorous even about her desperation and the fact that she's calling right back. I have to call you back, he whispered. No, hello. I'll call you right back. And he hung up. I dissolved into a pool of narcotic relief. So then a little later he calls back. What's up? He said. My heart fell. What was up? Well, I got the video. I loved it. And I really, really miss you. A little further down. We were silent together for a long time. I blinked and fat tears rolled to my chin. I could hear his breathing. It sounded strange. Oh, he was crying. He was crying. I shouldn't have sent you that, he rasped. It's just going to set us back. I made you something too, but I glanced at the call me chair in the grass. Didn't send it. Which I have a big ha right next to this because, in fact, that it's, the whole chair thing is just so funny. And again, the absurdity of that and sort of the kind of weird, campy, dark comedy nature of it is so perfect. Then on the right across, Davy says, no calling or texting after this. That was our time, and I'll never feel like that again. But I can't think straight when you're in my life. You understand? Yes. He couldn't think straight. So if you want me to be happy, not happy like I was with you, but happy in a normal way that I can like build a life on, then you won't call. Okay. Or text. I get it. I love you and I want you to be happy. I want you to be happy too. You know I'm not going to say I love you. He kind of just had. I felt so jolly and generous, I almost added, you're going to be a great father, but I didn't. We got off the phone warmly, almost laughing, saying, I'll see you when I see you. So what's so funny and actually very effective in this dialogue is she's having the conversation with Davy, but in these kind of, in the glosses, which are just like the words that come on the outsides of the dialogue, her dialogue is so good. Even the part in the beginning of this when he says, I have to call you right back. I'll call you right back. That's exactly the way it would go. And, a rule of thumb in writing is you shouldn't repeat something like that, especially not in dialogue, but it's so effective because it gives us a sense of urgency. And it's also exactly the way that people say that. But then a little further down, in all of the glosses in this excellent dialogue are kind of these conversations that she is having with the reader. Like when he says, I can't think straight when you're in my life, you understand? And she says, yes. And then outside of that, it says, he couldn't think straight. So you have this sense of her excitement and her relief at what he is saying. But the fact that she's articulating it for the reader is building an intimacy with the reader that's incredibly effective. And even like this notion here of, I'm not going to say I love you. He kind of just had. I mean, that kind of thing is so clever and it's so efficient. It's just so incredibly well done. The next example of humor we're going to look at is after the affair with Davy has essentially ended. It's in the second part, and our narrator is finally having a very frank conversation with her husband about what has been going on. I would confess, and this would be the start of us finally breaking through. Unfortunate timing, since I wasn't in the mood to break through right now. So funny. I mean, this idea that like at some point they're going to break through and they're really going to have this intimacy together. And then like unfortunate timing, I wasn't in the mood to break through. The use of breakthrough, again, that repetition is so, so strong. This also did, I mean, it was interesting to read through this because I did have this sense of like, what's happening with Paris? Like, is he just crushed by this whole thing? But in fact, I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier. Mike Mills and Miranda July separated, I believe in 2022. And now they actually live together in a home together with each of them having a girlfriend. So there are 4 adults living there, and I would imagine Hopper too. So you get the sense perhaps that very much like what happens in this novel, that Mike Mills is going to find someone who has already broken through with him, someone who really adores him. Okay, but continuing along here, unfortunate timing since I wasn't in the mood to break through right now. But I might feel differently in the moment, the way people who suddenly accept Jesus Christ into their heart were like, Jesus who? Just seconds before being born again. I sat up, bracing myself. He was finding the words. And then she thinks he's going to confess, but he doesn't. Oh, no confession. He was saying there were limits to how long one could mope around, and apparently he did it in the right amount. It's a little more than that, I said sharply. What I'm going through isn't the same as you when you're making an album. He turned off the TV, took a long, slow breath, and waited for my big reveal. The big reveal, that is a phrase that comes up again and again, and it's really important because this notion that there's going to be a sudden reveal is both, it's very appealing in lots of ways that suddenly something is going to happen, but lots of what is alluded to in the book, both in terms of personal transformation and in terms of desire and love, aren't these things that are suddenly big reveals. They are, in fact, a slower process of like blossoming, for lack of a better word. So he turned off the TV, took a long, slow breath, and waited for my big reveal. Good God, what had I done? This was not the plan. I was supposed to clean and snap the rubber band until I got over Davy. Which is also fun. You have this sense of her panic, which could be really desperate feeling and really dark and kind of awful and too heavy. But instead, it's funny because this idea that, if she was snapping a rubber band and cleaning her house carefully, that somehow that would, help her get over her love sickness. You wouldn't understand, I muttered, trying to wiggle away. Try me, he said with a cold little smile. He was already furious about whatever I was going to say next. I bent my head and drew my knees to my chin, desperately trying to come up with some event or condition that would shut this down, something frightening but not too extreme, a conversation ender. It's menopause. So I love this so much. And then, of course, he's relieved, and then they, kind of muddle through for a bit longer. I was so happy at this point in the novel because I felt like the whole thing was opening up again. We are about at the midpoint of the novel here, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is not a book about, a woman having an affair in a hotel room. This is a book about perimenopause. And I was so pleased. And I had this sense that the second half of this book is going to be really much more pertinent in some ways to all women and to me personally. I was so happy about it. But it also is so funny because, of course, she doesn't know at this point. She's 45, our narrator. She doesn't know that she's going through menopause. So this idea of saying that she is before she knows it is so, so good. It also is really important that as a woman, if you say menopause, it is in fact a conversation ender. I mean, it was such a relief for this guy because he's like, okay, that explains everything. It explains the mopiness and the craziness and the self-absorption and the, the labile emotions and all the rest of the things. Like, I think menopause for so long has been this mysterious thing that if you mention it, it's this large umbrella of stuff that men, I think, really don't understand, and frankly, not enough women fully understand. Which we're about to get into, but it is so funny here as a real bombshell and one that is very comedic, but is also very telling about what is going to happen in the rest of the novel. It's so good. The next tiny passage we're going to look at it's mostly just funny. Lots of times these passages that are really funny are working really hard to do other things. In this case, it has a lot to do with their family dynamic, but it's also just hilarious. We all drove out to a rescue shelter in Torrance. It smelled like hell. which is so funny, like to have the one thing be that. Also, Torrance is, Torrance is such a great name. It's, a little bit inland from LA, probably hot and like, a lot of parking lots and whatnot. But the idea of Torrance, it's like torrents, like, like a torrent of water. It's this idea of having things like be flowing out of your control. It's also really important to think of Monrovia and Arcadia, which are those towns that she is in when she stops. I mean, Arcadia is like this long lost, like heaven. Like Arcadia is this kind of utopian mythological place that's like this perfect place. And the fact that it's like slightly inland from LA and is, a place where you would find a couple of motels and a Hertz dealership. I don't have a context for Arcadia and Monrovia, but in fact, I think they're very, not even, I don't know if you will call them suburban, but the sense of them as being, a lot of strip malls and whatnot, and really in some ways being the opposite of what she finds, but also the kind of place where she is able, because of her creativity, to build something like the room that she builds in the motel. So they're out at the dog shelter in Torrance. The dog person working there says this: "Some people adopt this kind of dog not realizing the daily upkeep. I've had dogs my whole life," Harris said, offended. "I know nothing about dogs and I'm kind of afraid of them," I added. So funny, so funny. Sam named him Smokey the Bear. Almost immediately, Smokey broke his leg. Now we had a puppy with a cast and a cone who shit and peed indoors. This was all fine with me. So this is speaking to her desperation. It's speaking to their dynamic. It's speaking, to Harris's pride in some ways. It's also speaking to her vulnerability, and also the fact that they're on very, very different pages about what is a very large event. Also, it's so fun to look back at this because the warning that this dog person is giving them, like this dog needs a lot of grooming, ends up being something that they do not heed. And in fact, it becomes a real problem for poor little Smokey. And it also, is a very important moment of their kind of bonding. They have this terrible time when they have to be clipping, all the hair off of the dog's butthole so it can shit. But it's this very kind of bonding thing that happens between the two of them. So the seeds of that being sown here with a little discord and showing how they're in very different places is all so excellent because of how it plays out later. We're going to take a look at a very important instance of humor, which is when our narrator is having her experience with Audra. So this is an experience where there's a lot of sexual, very explicit sexual writing happening, and there is a certain amount of levity in the whole thing that really saves it from being like kind of too intense, I think, for the reader. I mean, this is certainly not erotica. In fact, Miranda July said this thing in one of the interviews about how she had written a lot of stuff. In fact, she wrote a scene where Davy and the narrator actually consummate, their love. And she wrote a lot of sex scenes that were apparently very hot and that she was, found very arousing. But a lot of what she wanted to capture was this kind of writing that had more to do with the awkwardness of sex and had more to do with kind of the strangeness of it, partially because she is very interested in sex, which we're gonna get to that in a minute with a statement that she has. But the fact is that humor here is incredibly important in terms of inflecting this scene and making it not quite so wacky for the reader. This is when Audra is telling her, she's getting very aroused because Audra is telling her all about how she essentially like brought Davy, into his sexuality. So she's of course lying there the whole time. I mean, she's not lying there, she's masturbating. Audra speaks. "I danced the way I danced in the video for my ex-boyfriend, naked except for the belt. I waited to see if she was going to do the dance, but she didn't, thank God. And so I shut my eyes and licked my hand, which was unnecessary." People, I have to say, I keep getting interrupted here by one of my adult children whose telephone broke, and she's in New York City, and she's at the AT&T store, or maybe the Apple store, I don't know, and is in full panic because she thinks she lost all of her data. So I keep having to stop and get these codes and sending them to her. So all of that is simply to say that this whole parenting thing never really eases up. I mean, that's not true. It totally eases up. And having kids in their 20s is amazing. And being 54 is amazing. But, they're going to keep calling you for some sort of passcode or some sort of digits or something. Okay, back to the sex scene. "He was so nervous. He wanted it the way it was in his head, probably aggressive, macho, but I could feel him shaking. So I turned to him and just put my arms around him, and we stood like that. naked with his boner between us, and then we started to kiss. So obviously what's so funny there is boner. I mean, here's Audra telling, and Audra is such an amazing character. All of the minor characters in this work are so well drawn. You know, you might be worried that you would have kind of a type, like she might be some like weird, somewhat creepy Earth Mother type, but and she is like a little bit like that, but she's also just incredibly compelling and well-rounded. And even you know, the women who come and talk to our narrator about their marriage or talk to her about whatever it is that's going on. All of those characters are memorable and interesting, and they're unique. It's just, she's so good with minor characters. So, but back to our sex scene. It was very strange having it told to me instead of telling it to myself. She put each image in my head so I didn't even have to think. At first, I jerked off presentably, the way I thought other women masturbated, but ultimately I gave up, tensed my body into an ugly rigor mortis, and let my hand go frantic. The first time I came, after she described him hungrily lapping at her pussy, she paused in the story, which kind of threw me. Is she waiting for me to recover? Ew. But we kept going. So this is so excellent. I mean, in part, I love the idea of talking about women masturbating and also talking about the way that sex doesn't look the way that we wish it did. I mean, maybe sometimes it does, but often it's very awkward and very weird looking. So this idea of some sort of glamorized view of sex, and I'm not even really thinking of porn here, I'm just thinking about sort of like what people might imagine it looks like when women masturbate. But this idea of really sort of taking that down, I mean, the idea of the hand being frantic and the rigor mortis, like all of this is so compelling. And then there's an M dash around, a couple of M dashes around, which is my favorite punctuation mark, you know. But it's around this excellent phrase, which is she waiting for me to recover? Ew. Which is so funny. It's so, I mean, it's so real in some ways. Like this idea of a woman who's having multiple orgasms might need like a second. But also this idea of like how ew and how kind of yucky that would be. So I'm so impressed with the way that this writing is very frank and it's very real. And it's really, I mean, I did not find it filthy. I found it so fascinating. I love thinking about, I do not love thinking about other people having sex, but I'm really interested in the idea that it is such a private thing. I mean, there are many reasons why it's a private thing. I understand why it's a private thing, but I also think it's weird. She talks at one point about being very siloed in our marriages and not really discussing how our marriages are going. Like this idea of, you know, everyone's just sort of like doing the thing that's prescribed and not in fact sharing information. And that's exactly the same way as it is with sex. I mean, I am lucky enough to have a group of girlfriends where there's a decent amount of conversation about sex, but you know, there should be more. The last thing I will say about this section before we move on to our last example of humor in the novel is I really enjoyed the sex scene between our narrator and Audra because there was such a great description of desire for a woman's body who is older and who is much rounder. It just was really great in many ways to have this vision, at least a mental vision, of a body that usually is not seen in these ways, and sex that is not, you know, sort of, out there in the world for people to consume. And I just thought it was so well done and so interesting and really a great choice. And I can see why people, you know, would think it's kind of filthy or might be like, oh gosh, or like, you know, a little embarrassed by the whole thing. But I also think it's so important to have these descriptions of sex that is not, in fact, what we are either imagining, you know, in Bridgerton or seeing in porn. So I really felt like this was very strong. I'm going to interject one very important point because I'm afraid I'm going to forget it later. One of the things that Miranda July said in one of these interviews is that she was a little reticent about the idea of sort of being equated with aging and sort of like writing what the New York Times called, you know, the great perimenopausal novel. She really understood that, in fact, she would be sort of attached to this idea, and she was a bit reluctant. But in looking at the younger generation, you know, in seeing how like women who are 20 years old right now, how they are approaching this and realizing that it is so different and that their experience of this time of life is going to be so different. They're much more open. They're much less, you know, confined. I mean, open in the sense of being more frank and being more revealing, but they're also much less confined, you know, to categories and to expectations and marital beliefs and the way parenting goes. So this idea of these younger generations coming up, first of all, that they are going to do it very, very differently, but that she really needed to do it in order to voice the experience that so many women, her age and around that are experiencing. So far we have looked at humor as a way to understand the way that the narrator's relationship with their child is working. We have looked at sensuality and beauty. We have looked at the idea of scope and the kind of classical, frame of beauty, what with the Da Vinci Code. And we have looked at the comic nature of the writing about sex and how it really provides a lot of levity. But there's also a way in which she uses it to leaven sadness that is so incredibly effective. So I want to look at this on pages 296 and 297. There is throughout the entire novel this real sense of her relating to her father and some of his depression, which he refers to as the death field. So when she's absolutely wrecked because her relationship with this woman, Chris, has ended and she's feeling totally despairing, there's this really very sad but also very funny scene where she is in the bathroom crying and sort of can't pull herself together while her child is out playing in the other room. I peeked my head out. "You okay, Sam? I'm making something incredible, but it's not done yet, so don't come out." See, there is a God, which even that's kind of funny. I mean, the idea, it seems like almost too tidy that she really needs more time in the bathroom. And the kid is like, no, don't come out yet. But in fact, it's very funny the way that she then has this kind of quip about see, there is a God. Then she goes on. "My dad would have brought me into it, of course. A child was an especially good person to bring in because they really believed, hook, line, and sinker." "Death field," Sam would say. "Is that a real thing?" "Yes, it's the only real thing. It's time you knew." So I thought that was so funny. I have a ha in my margin, but in fact, it's very sad. This idea of a child being brought into a very dark place by a parent, and this idea that children are really very susceptible to this kind of, melding and this kind of sharing of anxiety or depression. So then Sam says that they're ready for the mom to come out, and we have this. "I flushed the toilet," which even that I thought was funny. She's really going for it here and trying to make it look like she's not just been hiding in the bathroom crying. "I walked out to the living room, one foot in front of the other. Sam was holding their Lego masterpiece behind their back with a big smile. But their smile wavered when they saw my face. 'What's the matter, Mama?' Here we go, death field. Well, deep breath, count to 3. This is, it's both funny, the idea of the death field, but it's also, there's a lot of tension here. You're like, oh, please don't bring your kid into it. And she says this, 'I was having a rough time in the bathroom.' That's okay. Sometimes it's not ready to come out. Maybe it's too soon." So it's so funny because here you have this adorable kid with their Lego creation and this idea that it's just a matter of constipation. So what's so smart about this is we're folding in all of this stuff about, intergenerational trauma and the depression and familial, genetics and, this real desperate sadness that this woman is having, and she's hiding in the bathroom and she's upset and doesn't want to show her child for fear, that will make a very large impression on them. And instead, it ends up being about constipation, which is so, it's such a relief on some level because you really don't want her to bring the child into it, but it's also it's just funny. It's just a funny way to close the scene. The sex writing, as I said, is just really excellent. What I really liked about this is the way that she used a lot of language that's just very straightforward. I had an MFA teacher who said that the best way to write about sex is just to say what is happening. So I really liked the fact that she did a lot of that. It's just description of, bodies and what is happening. But I also really like that she used words that are these sort of, explicit words that I think we think of as being male. And here we're going to have some explicit things, so you maybe turn off your volume. But, she uses words like cock or pussy or clit, words that are these sort of, words that are kind of aggressive and that have, in the past have belonged, largely, I think, to men. And in fact, I feel like this narrator is really using them in a way that makes them feel very much her own, which is just, it's liberating just in terms of the lexicon. So Miranda July has said this, and I thought it was such an interesting kind of overarching idea to really inform the entire take on sex in the novel. In the New York Times, she said this, "I was always interested in sex, even as a kid. Sex includes shame and humiliation and fantasies and longing. It's so dense with the kinds of things I'm interested in. And I really think that is so true. I mean, the stakes are high, the intimacy is real. It's generally a very private thing. So I think the idea of pulling back the curtain on all of that is incredibly interesting. And I like the way that she talks about how it has always been interesting. I mean, she doesn't seem particularly, worried about the fact that she was interested in sex as a child. In fact, she's just very upfront about this and a lot of other things. So we're now going to move on and talk about menopause. The New York Times, I think it's like their headline that says that Miranda July has written the great perimenopause novel, which is obviously a play on the idea of the great American novel. And part of the reason why I really like the use of that is the great American novel has long been the provenance of men. It's people like Philip Roth or I don't even know who, like John Updike. I love the idea of this woman as writing the great perimenopause novel. It also speaks to the fact that perimenopause is something that is kind of difficult to pin down and something that we as a nation really need to understand and appreciate. So there was a really interesting interview where July was talking about the fact that she couldn't see beyond the phase of reproduction as a woman. And in fact, she noted that like the attention to the child rearing years is like actually really overanalyzed, and that the medical establishment is actually kind of, and the media and everything are kind of over involved. Like there's too much attention that is being paid to women as mothers. And then everything, as she says in the book, kind of falls off this cliff. So you have this sense of somebody as really needing to fill that vacuum. I really loved the fact that there is a chart in this book. And before that actually keeps coming up in interviews and reviews and whatnot. And Miranda July herself was like, oh, it's my first chart that was ever in a novel. But I also really liked the fact that there was a list of symptoms that came before. And as our narrator is sort of coming to terms with the fact that she is entering perimenopause or is already in it, this long list of symptoms was actually so informative. I mean, I think, everyone thinks of the very limited symptoms, hot flashes and not sleeping and like rage. But in fact, that list is very, very long. I myself, I'm 54 years old. Just have finally, reached menopause, and I didn't have hot flashes and I didn't have, disrupted sleep, but I was having recurrent urinary tract infections, and I did not know that that was a symptom, and I did not know that they can become chronic and it can be like this whole problem. So I feel very lucky to be part of the generation of women where hormone replacement therapy is suddenly back on the table. It seems like something that people are understanding is a very important resource for women. So I loved the idea of really speaking almost very medically to the symptoms and then having this chart. I also, though, really loved the point in the book where they go back to try to find the chart that has the cliff, and how she says that it's almost like the internet just kind of like magically provides you with what you need at the time, and all she can find is one that's like, stair steps down or a gradual decline, and she can't find this cliff-like graph that is in the book. But you have this sense, again, of the cliff as being incredibly important, but also this sense of providing information. I also found it incredibly inspirational, this kind of open sourcing and this idea of really listening to a lot of women, not just about, how perimenopause was, but essentially like what is the best part of having gotten through it so that we can look toward the future. In interviews, July is also very upfront about the fact that she has all of these mentors who are older women, and she has incredible respect for them and sees them as just like incredibly important people in her life, but was having a very hard time connecting the dots from her story to their story. And I think that speaks to the fact that there is this kind of missing chunk of time. We have kind of this crone energy of women who are much older, but the idea of women in sort of 45 to 60, I mean, there's plenty of literature out there, but not really addressing those women at this point in time and what is happening with their desire and what is happening with their bodies. So it's such a revolutionary way for her to really put front and center this period in women's lives, but really to have it be very, very focused on sexual desire, which I just think I mean, I'm not sure that everyone's experience, I mean, guaranteed, not everyone's experience. In fact, I'm not sure anyone's experience of perimenopause is exactly like this, but certainly you have this idea of bringing to the fore information that's extremely important. We're going to talk now about feminism very briefly. It's interesting here at the Foxed page. I will often take a look at a novel that feels like it might be sort of a feminist statement, but that's kind of a little murky, and we'll have to kind of do some sleuthing and have to look at the data in the novel and make an argument and support it. But in this novel, it's very clearly a feminist novel in lots of ways. And July herself has said this. What's confusing about being a feminist? It's just being pro your ability to do what you need to do. It doesn't mean you don't love your boyfriend or whatever. When I say feminist, I mean that in the most complex, interesting, exciting way. So I love that idea that if you're, defining it broadly in the sense of like, you just have to do what you want to do. And she's a very good object lesson in terms of like having ambition. The whole book is really very much about this drive to be creative and her need to work and to do her art and the way that it impacts all of these different aspects of her life. So this idea of feminism as being sort of the undergirding of all of this is both very inspirational and just very important. I want to read this one part about how closely aligned the idea of sex and feminism is. And it's sort of, the sex for our narrator here is really very necessary. So we have the counterpoint, again, these foils in her grandmother and her aunt. These are women who, around the time that they would have been menopausal had actually killed themselves. And so on 72, she has this about the daughter of the grandmother, about her aunt. 23 years later, Ruthie jumped out the same window. She hung in there longer than her mom, but not by much. This happened 7 or 8 years ago, before it had really occurred to me that I was next in this matriarchal lineage. And then right across the page here. But to be clear, I had not at any age desired a specific male body in the way I did now. While all my boyfriends and crushes had been reasonably good-looking, my attraction hovered up near their face, where they kept their talent and power. Lusting for the whole length of a person head to toe was what body-rooted fuckers did, Geordie and men. Now, for the first time, I understood what all the fuss was about. How something beautiful could strike your heart, move you, bring you down on your knees, and then, somewhat perversely, you wanted to fuck that pure, beautiful thing. Sex was a way to have it, not just to look at it, but to be with it. I suddenly understood all of classical art. There's some humor. The endless carved nudes, Venus in her shell, David, and sexy clothes. I had worn them without really understanding why. Thinking of sexy as one of many styles, not realizing it was the only style. You should always be emerging from a shell, if possible. Without knowing it, without really understanding it, I had been a body for other people, but I had not gotten to have one myself. I had not participated in the infuriating pleasure of wanting a real and specific body on earth. I lay in the center of the bed, unblinking. So this is extremely important because what we are having here is this idea that at the end of her reproductive years, once her entire self is not sort of caught up in the, in the urgency of creating a child, biologically speaking, she really is feeling desire in a completely different way. Importantly, it's much more like a man. She also, concedes that there are plenty of women, like her best friend Geordie, who are already operating like this, who have this kind of body-rooted sex drive. But it's this very important transition that is happening for her because, in fact, liberation is coming with a heightening of desire. And I think, we all sort of assume that women, who are menopausal are not going to be sexual anymore. And that's just crazy. I want to close this discussion of feminism just very briefly with one example of just this image that I found so moving. This is on page 217. I imagined getting up right now, slipping out the front door, and finding that all the women in the neighborhood were also leaving their houses. Soon it was just a million women waiting for their mates to call, to be needed, and then to fall into panic and guilt, to be torn, which was our primary state. Start the revolution here, now, in this field? Or drive home and slip back into the fold, use the electric toothbrush, feel grim and trapped? Of course, there was no decision to make because we were already home, not in a field. There was no collective tipping point. Most of us wouldn't do anything very different, ever. Our yearning and quiet rage would be suppressed and seep into our children, and they would hate this about us enough to do it in a new way. That was how most change happened, not within one lifetime, but between generations. If you really wanted to change, you had to believe that you were both yourself and your baby. You had to let yourself be completely reborn within one life. Of course, the danger was in risking everything, destroying everything for nothing, as I had done tonight. So clearly she is at a very low ebb at this point, but this is a very important part. I mean, the idea of kind of jettisoning everything and really remaking herself with a lot of desire and unconventional attitudes toward marriage and like where you are spending your time, meaning if you're spending the night in your studio or if you are living in a home with your girlfriend and your separated non-sexual husband and his girlfriend. I mean, all of this idea of sort of unconventionality has to come, from this idea of kind of really taking a good hard look and then jettisoning a lot of our sort of preconceived notions about how these institutions function. I found this it's just such a haunting idea, this idea of the women all, with their cell phones out in the middle of the field, ready to start a revolution. And, not only are they being torn by their families, but in fact, they're not in the field. They are in their homes. So it's both a very inspirational, but also like a very cautionary kind of image. We're going to close by taking a look at the very end of the novel, but I want to make quick mention of the importance of room 321. So we talked earlier about the aesthetics of that room and the idea of beauty and the idea of this being this removed and private space that is thoroughly not domestic. It's also very importantly happening in a motel, which is a liminal space. We have talked about liminal spaces before. Anytime you're reading, if you have characters who are in a liminal space, which is like a doorway or a hallway, but can also be a hotel room or an airplane terminal or a bus station, anywhere where there's kind of movement, oftentimes that will signal to you that in fact change is happening, transformation is happening. So the idea of a motel is even more, sort of suggestive of transformation than a hotel, because you have this idea of cars and the easy access and the idea of them built around motors and cars, which is, all about transformation and transportation. So we have this room that is very important and is not just about Davy. It becomes about Audra and it becomes about all of the women who come to the room. It's a place where one of her friends can take a bath. It's a place where she really has very important conversations and learns a lot about herself. So, but it's very important that the room is actually called 321, room 321. So I once was teaching Beloved many, many years ago, and I had a student, very smart woman, who was talking about how 124, the opening of that novel is 124 is spiteful. And we had done a lot of thinking about why that number is important. It is the number of the house where Setha is living. But her idea, and I think it's spot on, is that 124 is called that because Beloved, who is the third child in the family, is missing. So essentially you have 1, 2, and then you're missing the 3, and then you have the 4. So whenever you have a specific number, and certainly if it's Toni Morrison and it's the first word of the novel Beloved, you need to really take a minute and think about what this means. So if we take this idea of room 321, I mean, as I'm saying it out loud, you're probably hearing it. But this idea of 3-2-1 go or 3-2-1 blast off, really, I think she is, encouraging us to see this as like, something that is, you're getting ready for something new. You're getting ready for a new race or a new challenge or a new explosion. Also, the 3-2-1, I think you can look at it as their family. So they are 3 people in the family. And then in some ways, when she is separating from her husband, then it's more, a parent dyad thing with the child. So you have, instead of it being a family of 3, it becomes about, the mother and the child. But you can also, I think, look at it as like 3, 2, 1. We have 3 people in the family in the beginning, and then her departure is leaving the other 2 behind. So there we have our 2, and she is finally a 1. She's finally on her own when she takes this trip, and therefore can learn a lot about herself. I think it's also somewhat important that we have 3, 2, 1. The next thing would be 0. So there's quite a bit in the book, and Miranda July has spoken about this in interviews, this idea that after reproduction, women have, it's not clear what happens. Like you have all of these kind of fantasies and all of these roadmaps and all of these societally kind of mandated ideas about what your childhood and your youth and your college days and your family life, you have a sense as a woman of what all that's supposed to look like and your career. But then, the roadmap kind of ends. And in the second half of your life, what you are moving toward, in fact, is death. So, the darker way to look at this is that it's 3, 2, 1, 0. The idea of impending death really adds urgency to whatever it is that you're going to do with the second half of your life. So I just found that number as very compelling. And it's something that I think if you don't hear it out loud, you're reading it on the page, it might not jump out at you as much. But again, with someone who is as talented as Miranda July, it's important to take a beat and do a little thinking about what these details might mean. The room, in fact, is very important at the close of the novel. Again, this is 5 years into the future. Our narrator has finally made it to New York and, in fact, is watching Davy do a different dance. This one, is very elevating and very important. She says this: "Suddenly, I wanted to stay here and for this to go on and on. But from the music, I could tell the performance was almost over. It would end when he landed. Any second now, I'd be clapping. The lights would come up. In the meantime, he was still rising, and the warm, hallowed feeling kept growing. I could feel it expanding beyond the walls, into the street. It would still be there when I got outside, gilding the whole neighborhood, the whole city. Indeed, the whole world was the motel room. The whole universe? Yes, everything was the room. You could not step outside of it, not even by dying. And he was still rising into the air. If 321 was everywhere, then every day was Wednesday, and I could always be how I was in that room. Imperfect, ungendered, game, unashamed. I had everything I needed in my pockets, a full soul." Then down at the bottom, "Gratitude came like a punch in the gut, and because it's always such a relief not to be an asshole after all, tears streamed down my cheeks." Again, here we have a moment of levity, a moment of humor. "The person sitting next to me was also wet-faced, and we smiled a little bashfully at each other because ecstasy has a kind of built-in ridiculousness. And it wasn't just us. I looked out at the circle of faces and saw that every single audience member was going through some version of my revelation, some reckoning with the self they had been carrying around until now. I had not been the only one knotted in miserly pain. That was part of the ride. Resistance, then giving in. He was no longer ascending. He had reached the apex and quickly fell. Outside, it was early evening. There was plenty of time. I decided to walk. The sun was just beginning to set, golden light everywhere." I love this ending so much. I do think it's really beautiful the way that it sort of echoes the cover of the book. We have the art on the front echoing the end, but it's mostly just this beautiful kind of down-to-earth, optimistic sense of hope and of possibility. It's just absolutely lovely. I'm going to leave it there. I hope that this look at Miranda July and her new work has been a good way to really appreciate the book a little more. I was so moved. Diving into some of these larger questions has been so gratifying. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.